Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome back to Basics. I am Moe ElHussini, and I am here with my dear friend George Elias. Welcome back, Mr. George. How are you doing?
Doing well, Mo. Good to see you. It's a nice sunny day.
Same here.
Been rainy. I was hoping there wasn't a correlation between our podcast and rainy days. So I'm glad the pattern's broken.
Yes.
But it is awfully cold. It's starting to get cold towards the end of the semester here.
Yeah, I know. The fall flew by, the semester. It flew by. It always does. I have no idea why, but it just I can't believe we're already in November. I'm talking to the students about finals and,
oh boy,
term papers. Yeah, it's crazy. George, do you remember? I know last time we were talking about body language and facial expressions and such, posture, hands, and so on. Where did we leave off? I know it was an interesting discussion, but we had to end it. Do you remember what was the last point we were discussing?
So, if I recall, the last conversation we had, we were talking about facial expressions, and I was relating my own personal experience on how my facial expressions are connected to my emotions. And in order for me to control my facial expressions, I, in my own personal experience, need to control my emotions. And I also threw out a question to you that you said you might think about. I asked if there's any cultural aspects to that, the strong connection between emotions and facial expressions.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah.
Keep going. Yes, keep going, sorry.
Yeah, and just to throw out another one, just in terms of, facial expressions and culture and whether they're totally universal or certain cultures may use them, certain expressions differently, things like that.
Now I remember. Good point. What are you good if we start from that point, use that as our starting point today? Because I did think about that question over the week. You're good with that? Shall we do that? Shall we continue from here?
Sure, let's go for it.
Do you know what I thought about? Yes, I think there is a relationship, to answer your question, between your beliefs, your culture. I don't want to go as far as religion, maybe, yes, religion, but we don't want to open up the conversation too deep or too wide. Let's focus on culture, right? I do strongly believe that there is a relationship between your facial expressions and culture, your cultural background. And to give us a point of reference, a starting point, call it whatever you want, I thought about cognitive dissonance. Right. And for some of the listeners that don't know what that means, this was a concept, a theory that came about in the 50s, I think 1950s. Simply put, it talks about some inconsistencies that could happen between what we believe, what's in our head, and our actions. Meaning, George tells me one thing. Inside of me, it's pissing me off, it's upsetting me, it's stressing me out, I'm in turmoil inside my head, but my actions reflect someone that is happy, smiling, relaxed, agreeable, right? So there's a disconnect between what goes on in my head and what I'm actually doing. And that, I think, creates some discomfort in some people, right? Some tension when they do feel that disconnect between both. Some people, and I'm going to use this as a starting point, George, and you can share your thoughts. I think some people may deal with this by trying to acquire some information. So you said something to me that triggered that kind of reaction where I'm thinking one thing and I'm acting in another way. I may seek to ask you for some more info to try to agree with you, to eliminate that tension or discomfort, or I might try to minimize the impact of that inconsistency or gap that's in my mind so that I can kind of relax myself a little bit. Your thoughts. I'll give it back to you before I continue and go into culture in more detail. What do you want to add to what I said?
I'm still stuck on the big terms of cognitive dissonance that you brought into our back to basics conversation here. So still trying to
Well, I said something.
that.
I said something that you don't know or you can't talk about. That's the first in 35 years. Wow. Let me savor the moment. Go ahead.
So I'm just trying to connect it a little bit to the facial expression. So are you saying that you're in a situation, let's say, where you're in polite company that's, you know that you need to smile and look pleasant, but something is going on that is not making you happy, right? Is that, and so on the inside, you're feeling like, because I think we've all been there, right? Where you're forced to try to look pleasant, you're forced to try to put that grin and bear it per se. Maybe it's so I'll tell you my story is, my parents would take me around everywhere, even to their friends' houses, and we were expected to sit in the corner and look pleasant, or and not have entertainment per se. So as kids, we had to learn how to try to behave and look pleasant, even though we were mildly being tortured, being completely bored out of our minds, right? So is that is that the type of, not literally torture? I'm just saying, as kids, you're terribly bored, right? So I mean, is that the scenario that we're talking about, where you're forced to try to act a certain way, where inside you're completely feeling something else?
Yes, that's absolutely an example. That's definitely an example. And I could give you, I'll give you another example too, right? To try to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. Let me bring in culture. Some cultures prefer what we would call direct communication, just being blunt upfront about what you're feeling. Some would prefer an indirect kind of discussion, right? Where you're not really like, I'm not telling you, George, listen, you screwed this up, you need to fix this ASAP, it's your fault that this happened. Versus some people may prefer to have an indirect type of dialogue. How do you feel about, and you do this a lot, I notice when we talk with people, you try to be very diplomatic, saying, how do you feel if we had done this instead of that? How do you feel if we had taken this approach? Instead of saying, you know what, you did this wrong. So picture this, George, right? Me and you, different beliefs in our mind. Let's say I believe in the direct and blunt, right? And you favor, this is just hypothetically speaking, you favor the indirect approach. Now, I'm standing with you in front of 5 people that we were doing something with, a project, working on something with, and I take you by surprise. Those people had done something wrong. I take you by total surprise, and I just confront them straight up, tell them, you guys messed this up. You should have done this, before we even say hello, right? Which is not the approach that you would have wanted to take. So now you're kind of like stuck in the middle between, do I go along with Moe and support him and back up his line of discussion? Or do I stop Moe and restart, hit a reset button and say, Moe, no, wait a second, let's take this in a different way. Do you know what I mean, George? So like you're kind of like in that situation where inside your head, you're thinking that this whole approach is wrong and should have been done in a different way. But yet now that I started this line of discussion and the whole defensive mechanisms are kicking in and, being on attack and on the defensive, you have no choice but to join in with me to continue the discussion with those 5 people. So you will be taking on some activity which you don't really believe was the right approach from the beginning. But now you're kind of like, for whatever reason, you feel bad for me, you don't want to embarrass me, you kind of, like you feel like it's too late, whatever your reasoning is, but now you're acting in a way that's different from what was in your mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. And I think that there's, so just to be plainly blunt about that, I try to avoid those scenarios, just me personally.
I know,
some of that is because if I think there's a chance in a business sense, if there's a chance of that happening, I do pre-briefs about the approach. I try to get us to all agree on how, like, let's say we're going into a meeting and we believe, regardless if they're a customer or a subcontractor or something of that nature, if we believe that we've been wronged in some way, we try to agree on the approach, right? Who's going to be the main speaker, who's going to be subordinate. So in a business sense, we do that with pre-meeting planning, right, to avoid that, because I've been in those scenarios, and for me personally, they've usually not ended very well. I'll tell you one story. We had a customer that was saying things that just plain weren't true. Objectively, it's just not true. It was just not true, right? So the leader of the meeting, and I'll try to keep names out of it to not embarrass people. The names of the meeting. Now, the leader of the meeting was my supervisor, my boss.
Okay.
And he decided to directly tell the customer that they were a liar. He actually called them a liar, and that made me very, very uncomfortable. And normally I wouldn't do that, but I saw the customer was very taken aback and very upset by that comment, and I decided to step in. In hindsight, maybe not the best thing to do, but I decided to step in, and I said, hey, I'm not sure if they're a liar. I can say for sure that I don't think what they're saying is factually accurate. Maybe we should ask why they're saying this, given that it's not factually accurate, and point out, where the facts are. Maybe they're just mistaken, right? Anyway, I got I nearly got thrown out of the room. It was very nasty, actually, and a very embarrassing scenario. I was embarrassed personally, but I was also embarrassed for my supervisor and the way he was acting. I'm still not sure if what I did was right or wrong, but I felt as though pointing out, that you don't just flat out call your customer a liar, which was probably the right thing to do. But like, for those reasons, the way I felt, I had to act on it, and that's the way I felt at the time. So I try to avoid cognitive dissonance, if that's what you call it. I'll grin and try to look pleasant and polite company, even if I don't like that. But I'm probably going to try to leave whenever I can, without looking too impolite. So Mo, you're bringing up the cognitive dissonance, and it's been interesting. But how does that affect business situations? Are you saying it, for instance, like in negotiations, you might want to keep the poker face on, even though you don't like their offer?
I wasn't thinking about that example, but I'll give you an example that has to do with negotiations. But let me just do a quick comment about what you just said. I think the example that you gave is a mix between your beliefs and what you believe you should do, and the fact that you're seeking more information to diffuse or dilute that cognitive dissonance. You get what I mean? Like, remember what I said earlier, that sometimes you seek information? That's exactly it. You're trying to do the proper right thing to get some information, to either agree with what your boss is saying to some extent, right? Or to show him in a professional way that, you know what, no, let's give them a chance, there's just misunderstanding. But let me go back to your question. Negotiating, again, me and you, and I'm going to make myself be the bad guy again. Let's say me and you are sitting together and we're negotiating with a client, right? Now we're meeting with somebody in a country, right? So to bring in that cultural aspect of it, where quote unquote gifting, not bribing, but gifting is okay. So you see me sitting there, and I know based upon the beliefs and the customs of that culture that we're in, it's okay to take out a Rolex watch in a box wrapped up in a nice bow, nice gift wrap, and I give it to the head of operations of the company procurement that we want to work with. I'm like, oh, here's a nice little gesture that we just want to thank you for. You're taking the time to meet with us. Do you see what I mean, George, right? So you're sitting there looking at it, you're blown away that I just broke an ethical code where I'm, in your mind, bribing somebody, But even though in that country, that's actually considered, so to speak, a gift. Now, if we come back here to the US and our boss's boss's boss finds out that I did this, I'll be kicked out just like you almost did in that meeting that you were at, right? Because I did a big, big no-no. But over there, it's okay. So now you're sitting again in that dilemma. Your beliefs, your background is very different from the beliefs and the customs of the country that we're in, right? Cognitive dissonance again, right? So that starts a whole kind of conflicting view between what I did and what you believed to have happened, where there shouldn't have been a gift like this given at all because it's unethical, even though it's not illegal, but it's unethical. I shouldn't have done that. So that triggers, how do you act on the outside versus how you believe on the inside. So that's an example that comes right to my mind because I know this happens a lot, and I heard about it in a lot of interactions where the two differing culture views between two countries that are working together can come into play.
Yeah. So that situation that you bring up, it would be a one that I would have some major cognitive dissonance.
I know.
So you bring up an interesting, because I do think if we're working for a U.S. firm, we're Americans, we're bound by U.S. laws, and in the United States, bribing or that's corruption, and that's illegal, right?
Exactly.
So you literally can't do that. So you put me into a dilemma where I would feel obligated to report it, and even though you're my friend, and I feel a lot of affection for you, that would be a big problem for me, right? So I'd probably have a conversation with you.
Exactly. That's because I know how you would. I'm just looking at your face now, and I know you're looking at it like, what? I know that's exactly what you would do. And that's why I wanted to bring something up to an extreme, but that's exactly. But let me ask you, George, something. Okay, what about if we want to please that client, right? We want to obviously get the contract. So we take him out to dinner. If we take him out to dinner, is that wrong?
It depends to what level. So I'll just tell you where I work, we'd have to report that, right? And we'd have to talk about the like what was eaten, was there alcohol involved, who attended. So we would have that scrutiny, for my day job, right? My day job would scrutinize that. We'd have to report it, and ideally we'd get permission ahead of time on the levels and the scenario and what to do about that.
So the permission, where do you draw the line? Meaning, I went to a dinner one time at a Christmas time with a company back in the 2000s when I was in my corporate life, and we were in Bridgewater, New Jersey, and they bought an $8,000 bottle of wine, right? Extreme. Okay, what about if it was $1,000? What if it was $2,000 bottle of wine? What if it was a $500, $800? You get my point, right? Where does that cognitive dissonance kick in for people? And I'm just using an example. I know we can take this in a million different ways, but where does it become where, oh, wow, those people are really spoiling me. They're really taking good care of me versus, don't you dare spend more than X amount on something to please or schmooze with your client. Where do you draw that line? Or how do you think about, what parameters do you think about in your mind to decide to say, you know what, we're only going to go up to X amount of dollars per transaction, per meal, per dinner, per whatever, per gift? What do we think about?
Yeah. So I'll say that that it's a hard one without specifics, right? And I would say that there's clear lines where you're talking about those extravagant bottles of wine and some other things, and favors and gifts that go on, where I can tell you if you're doing business with, let's say, the government, that those are like immediate red flags, right? Huge red flags that you couldn't do. I would say in certain corporate scenarios, so some of that, I still think $1,000 bottle of wine is somehow a little crazy, but I do know that some of those things are a little bit more expected, right, in the way that you conduct business. I don't think it's all wrong. I've I've been in the corporate business to business world before, and some of those interactions, so some of those dinners are important ways that you build relationships with clients, the way you build rapport, that you get on a common line of bearing. So I don't think having dinner with clients or customers is a problem. I do think that if it gets to the point where you're doing special favors and bribing and doing business in a way that you wouldn't do, there's something wrong with that scenario for sure.
Okay. And I know we can spend hours talking about this and bring up different scenarios, meaning if you're selling a printer to that client versus if you're selling them a Boeing plane, right? Like if depending on the contract and how much you're getting at. I understand. But let me do this if it's okay with you. Let's switch to another dimension, and I'll give you another example of what could trigger cognitive dissonance, and based upon cultural views. Power distance. How much do I accept hierarchy authority based upon my boss, right? The power that or the authority that my boss has or that my boss's boss may have over me, right? What level of acceptance and obedience do I have based upon that? So in some cultures that are pretty authoritarian in their business practices, it's very normal, and I've seen this, honestly. I'm going to use a very, very, very extreme example in retail. I was meeting with a client, one of his sales reps in the business, and it was kind of like a warehouse, did a mistake. He slapped him on the face. And it was, the guy turned around and said, "Sorry, boss, I'm sorry about that." And he walked away and continued his work. He slapped him. The first thing that came to my mind, right? What if his wife was there? What if his kid was there? Would he still have slapped him? What if you get the idea, right? Like a million questions swirled through my mind, but all I could do, I stood back. I was 100% neutral, didn't comment in any way about what I saw, and I just continued our discussion, about what I was there for. But that to me, right, cognitive dissonance. My whole view of that manager after he did that slap changed. And I was thinking to myself, should it have changed? Should I stay the same way? I mean, in his country, now that I spent months there, I saw it happen by him, by others, and it's a norm. You drop something, you get physically punished for it. You mess something up, it's not like they're walking around slapping each other, but I'm saying it happens, right? So that opened up my mind to a whole kind of way of thinking when I'm dealing with people from cultures that have a whole different idea of power distance.
Yeah. So that comment about like the physical nature of that culture is kind of blowing my mind. And I don't want to derail the whole conversation about the what would I do in that scenario. But that would be terribly that would be terribly uncomfortable for me. That's not, and I do a lot of international business, and this is what I'll say. I'll get to the power distance in a second. Majority of the interactions that I have are in the nuance, and for instance, some certain cultures will be more forthcoming, like your previous example, than others. Some are more direct than others. And sometimes I need to listen and watch that culture or that person in that culture more closely to try to get their meaning. So for instance, if they're not as direct as the US culture, I really try to examine their words and try to understand what they're saying and ask more follow-up questions, because I want to make sure that I really captured whether they like it or not. Are they just telling me that it's okay, when they're saying this thing is horrible, right? So that's what they really mean. In the power distance, let me ask you if this is a good example.
Yes.
So in my company, we had a lot of former military people, and by the way, it's Veterans Day weekend, so if you're a vet out there, thank you for your service.
Oh yeah, thank you for your service.
Yes, but if we have we have a lot of vets, a lot of people in the military in my company. And oftentimes I find that they're very much in a hierarchy. I think because of the military training, they really respect leadership, right?
Yes.
And not saying that I don't respect, but sometimes when I'm working in a collaborative sense with some of these people, whether they're in business development or engineering, I will be willing to reinterpret, executive leadership's desires, right? I'm willing to reinterpret it to something that makes sense, something that I feel as though will, come down to me, and they're not. They're very much into, no, the authority, the power said that, I have to follow it to the letter. And my experience is, it doesn't make sense. I have to tell the executive what they're saying doesn't make sense. I need a follow-up because this doesn't make sense, or I will find a way for it to make sense and implement their desires in a sensical manner, right? Does that make does that kind of interact with that power distance?
And see, so you're saying you would ask questions to get some clarification, right? Like the gist of it is that, right? But what if you were in the military? Would you still ask why, or would you just go and do it?
It depends. So I'll tell you why it depends, right? So I feel as though when you're in the military, and this is just, I'll just tell you the way I am in the military. So if you're in a, let's say, a life and death situation, and you are getting an order that totally doesn't make sense, right?
Yes.
You should, I believe, ask them to repeat the order, right? Please repeat that order. Please confirm this, that you're requesting this. I think asking for confirmation makes sense. Now in the military, if you're in operations and you're being told, specific direction, it's set up in such a way where you have to do that, right? That because you not acting in a timely manner could mean life and death in a bad way for the people you're supporting. So I would do it, right? But I would probably ask for clarification. If I was in a military scenario and it was not a life and death, let's say combat scenario, I might, in a nice way, privately challenge my supervisor and say, look, this is what I'm seeing here. I'm bringing to you this privately. Of course, we'll carry it out as you're requested. But here's the way I see it, and because I'm your subordinate, I feel it's my obligation to make you the best you can. So here's what I say.
It's it'd be a whole other interesting discussion to talk about the differences between cognitive dissonance between the military world and the corporate world, and to try to bring somebody in that lives in that world to ask them, how, because I think it would be a whole different mentality how you deal with that disconnect in your mind with your actions, especially if you're in the middle of battle, right? I just thought of that now while we were talking, but anyway, no, but we're not going to get too deep into it now. But so those are kind of like the main things I thought about, right? Like power distance, the communication style, the culture, accepting change also, right? Like how much does someone believe in change versus stability and the fear of the unknown, asking somebody to do something that they think is going to change their world. I can think of many different examples where a cultural aspect or background would trigger a cognitive dissonance kind of a reaction.
So tomorrow, I just want to wrap it up, and I know we're running out of time, and not to bring something up last minute. But I was listening to a book, actually, listening to an audio book about how to talk to people, and one of the issues they brought up was being over the phone, right? And being over the phone is a scenario where facial expressions might not matter, right? But just thinking about cognitive dissonance and kind of like the almost the opposite of that is true too. And this person recommended that in order to sound pleasant on the phone, you want to purposely smile when answering the phone, even though the person can't see you.
I agree.
And that like you can actually drive your posture, your facial expressions, and the way you are over the phone in a way to present yourself vocally better. And I just think that concept of cognitive dissonance and how maybe to avoid it by continuing to have good expressions, good presentation skills, even when you're not necessarily being seen.
And you know what? It makes perfect sense for the same reason why people sometimes when they're arguing or fighting over the phone, they wave their fists, they shake their hands, they, you know, like they raise up, they swing their arms. I think in the same manner, it would also help if you do the opposite and try to smile, try to, you know, feel that confidence in your posture. So no, good point. I agree with you 100%. Now, this has been interesting, George. I'm glad we brought this up, and I think it was worth it to, you know, spend this time talking about cognitive dissonance. It was an interesting point, like, you know, bringing in that part of the negotiation, the decision-making process. It was worth the time, I think, to bring this point up so that, you know, just open up people's minds to it and have them think about it more. I'll definitely think about it more later, you know, like see what other factors could influence it.
Yeah, so Mo, what I'm thinking about is maybe for next time, let's talk about body language in more formal scenarios, like interviewing, presenting, and not just kind of like an everyday scenario, but maybe a special scenario where you might need to get dressed up or present, or, you know,
presenting is good.
Look like you're put together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like the sound of presenting, because I know we talked about interviews before. Definitely we can bring it up again, but yeah, let's bring in the presentation angle. I think that one would be useful to a lot of people. Sounds good, George. We'll do that, buddy.
So listen, let's just wrap it up here, Mo, and it's been a great conversation. And so thank you all for listening to this episode of Back to Basics on the Business Edge, brought to you by Feliciano School of Business at Montclair State University. We hope you enjoyed this podcast and welcome any feedback you have for us, including suggestions for future topics.
Thank you, George, and thank you to all of our listeners as always. And I look forward to our next discussion, buddy. We'll continue this dialogue. See you next time on Back to Basics podcast, everyone. Take care.
Awesome. See you next time.